fill your thirst beside the river. Wash the journey from your hands. Feel the comfort flow inside you. Come this far, you understand. Fear's not allowed, where dreams can be lost or found.
Jimmy, hush. Hi, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. I'm Rosemary Lachance, a Reiki energy healer and a spiritual advisor.
And I am Jimmy Driscoll, actor director.
And we are dedicated to providing you with food for thought, information, and answers to all modalities of alternative healing, spiritual development, animal welfare, environmental concerns, and so much more in the form of guest speakers who are experts in their fields. We ask you to embrace the show with an open mind. We will give you our contact information at the end of the show. And we'd love to hear any show ideas or any people that you think might be interesting for our show. Just let us know. Enjoy the show.
Okay, here we go.
Tonight is our 96th show.
96th show, and a very special guest. Go right ahead, Rosemary.
Is Raymond Bechard, author and human rights advocate. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming, Ray.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'll read your bio real quick for you. Okay.
So I know.
Okay. As you know, right, so you know Raymond's an author, speaker, and human rights advocate. He has worked to end injustices against all people for over 20 years. Bechard often advises social justice organizations in their mission to bring hope and encouragement to the world. Among other writings, oops, I just lost my microphone. Could you take
Among other writings, he's the author of the recently published book, The Berlin Turnpike, A True Story of Human Trafficking in America, which is a close historical examination of commercial sexual exploitation and its place within all American communities, and Unspeakable, the truth behind the world's fastest growing crime, an expose of child trafficking in all its forms around the globe. Mr. Bechard also began and is the committee chairman of Men Against Prostitution and Trafficking. Okay, the first questions we always ask you is what inspired you to do this work?
It depends on what your definition of the word inspiration is.
Well, as you know, our show is on spiritual development, all these things, so
I'm being a little bit facetious.
I know you are.
You know, it would be wonderful if the lights came down from heaven, if a voice spoke to me from a burning bush. You know, we read these stories in Scripture, and those guys had it easy. When they do have the clouds open up, when the lights come down from the angels, when the bush burns and says, this is what you're going to do.
God,
Wouldn't that be great?
Oh, terrific.
It's not that easy. However, when we begin to open our eyes a bit, become aware of our surroundings, open our minds, as you said at the onset of the show, we begin to see needs, we begin to see challenges, we begin to see problems. And I think many times we close ourselves to those things because those are the inspirations. Those are the calls of God. Whenever we see a need, whenever we see a person in need, how is that not the call of God?
You're right.
How is someone who's hungry or has no place to live or doesn't have any clothes or has no justice in their life or no freedom or no liberty, how is that not God putting in front of us his call to answer?
You're giving me goosebumps. Yes, you're right.
That need that people have in their lives is the simple call of God. This is one I just happen to see over and over again through my work with some churches and ministries throughout the world as we traveled, and I've done video documentation and all sorts of communications work for large ministries. And I kept seeing this issue, what I didn't even know was human trafficking at the time, but I saw it in different forms around the world, in Eastern Europe, in Israel, and Haiti. And I didn't know what to call it, but I saw it and really began to see this common need of its victims. Here we can call them exploited workers, or trafficking victims of commercial sexual exploitation. That's what the book focuses on. In Haiti, they're called restivics. Whatever they're called, they all have a common need. And I don't know if we can call it inspiration, but I saw this common need and I thought this needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that was your calling. That to me, that is divine intervention.
Yeah.
That's your calling, you know.
And then it depends on what level you want to really get your hands dirty when you address an ugly problem like this one. Some people are very good at holding a concert or a rally or an awareness program. That's wonderful. But it really depends on how close you want to get to the streets, to the victims. And the closer you do, the harder it gets for the people doing that kind of work.
Right. You wrote a book, The Berlin Turnpike. I think we have a picture of it that we're going to show on the screen.
Maybe we do.
There it is. USA Motel, the Berlin Turnpike. Now, are you talking about our Berlin Turnpike here in Connecticut?
I absolutely am talking about. This is the Berlin Turnpike that runs just south of Hartford through Wethersfield, Newington, Berlin, and through parts of Meriden, although it's called North Broad Street at that part. It's about 12 miles long. It was opened in October of 1909.
Wow.
And since then has an extraordinary history to it, from the days of Prohibition and rum running through the heady days of the 50s and 60s when it was really the only route from Hartford to New York.
That's right.
And businesses and were flourishing at that point. All kinds of businesses, not only motels, but nightclubs and family entertainment centers. It was really the golden era of the Berlin Turnpike, which ended the very day that Route 91 opened. Overnight, in the 60s, the traffic on the Berlin Turnpike decreased by 75%.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
My father had a business on the Berlin Turnpike at the time. It failed within just a few months, as did many, thousands of other businesses. And through the 60s and 70s, it became a near red light district. The Berlin Turnpike did, with strip joints and the motel rooms.
There are so many people who don't even know that.
Yes.
You know, I mean, there was, a couple people say, a couple strip bars or something like to that effect, but nobody knew that was.
No.
Though people did know, if you look closely enough, it was pretty obvious. To this day, right today, there are well over 1,000 motel rooms on the Berlin Turnpike through Newington, Berlin, and Wethersfield.
Wow.
There's near 40 motels, and they're still there. Now, the reason I titled the book The Berlin Turnpike, A True Story of Human Trafficking in America, is the book focuses on a federal trial that took place in Hartford in 2007, where it was discovered that two pimps, what we call pimps, what really under federal law, and we'll talk about that, are human traffickers, sold two girls for $600 each in a motel room in the Berlin Turnpike in Wethersfield in 2004. So it's not something that was just the 60s and 70s. It's happening today. And of course, there's commercial boulevards like this all across the United States, all across the world. But today, the metaphor I'm using, the Turnpike here in Connecticut for, is it has come into all of our homes through the internet. Not only the Berlin Turnpike, but the red light district itself, the combat zone, as we used to call it in Boston, now comes directly into our every online computer, into our living room or our kitchen, wherever, or our child's bedroom. So this trial that took place in 2007 really illustrates every aspect of how what we call commercial sexual exploitation, how it works in the United States, how it has worked and how it continues to work, and where it's really going and how it's exploding now because of the internet. It's funny, in the research for the book, I found a report that was commissioned by John D. Rockefeller in 1912 in New York City.
Really?
And it was called Commercialized Prostitution in New York City.
In 1912?
In 1912, and it was exactly 100 years ago.
Wow.
And the way the business of what they called commercialized prostitution in New York, back then they called it the white slavery trade. The way they describe it working in 1912 is almost indistinguishable between how it works today. In fact, I use quotes from that report 100 years ago to describe what's happening now.
Really?
So little has changed.
Wow.
You know, and there was a, you know, and people treat this issue, the human trafficking issue, and the subset of that, which is commercial sexual exploitation, as something new. Well, it's not at all. There were people speaking out against it in the 1830s in the United States, and then again 100 years ago in this near hysteria that was coming into all the cities of the United States, in New York, Chicago. And what really led to the very rapid passing of legislation, what we know as the Mann Act, which was a terrible piece of law. So flawed that 100 years later, the federal government passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, which has really allowed law enforcement to go after these traffickers at a federal level. Now, this trial that took place in Hartford was the first trial under that new law that took place in a courtroom in the United States, but was passed over by the media at the time in June of 2007.
Really?
It's a complex story. Human trafficking in itself. Why was this being called human trafficking? The girls weren't from outside the country. They weren't kidnapped. So they're really, and that's why I wrote the book, to explain how this crime works for the most part in the United States, how people use the internet, how people use local publications for the crime, to propagate the crime, the pimps do. And in this trial, it was discovered that the Hartford Advocate was the sole source or channel of advertising for this particular pimp, Dennis Paris. He just used the Hartford Advocate. In fact, the Advocate was mentioned over 60 times in the trial. They read the ads that he would place for his, what he called an escort service, into the trial testimony. It's in the book. 4.5 years later, those ads still run. If the federal government proved to be human trafficking ads, those ads are still running in the Advocate newspapers.
Why? Yeah.
Why?
Well, they make money from them. They make a, you know.
The Advocate makes money from it.
But there's not a law against doing that? I mean, if the government knows
it's that pesky
law
First
enforcement?
Amendment. You know, they have the freedom. They have the freedom to print whatever they'd like, and even though it would have to be voluntary, the Hartford Advocate, which is owned by the Hartford Courant, which is owned by the Tribune Company, would voluntarily have to call to pull those ads and lose that weekly income. We've been calling on them to do that for quite a long time, but the ads still run every week.
That falls under the category of greed.
Well, however you call it,
It does.
you know, in the trial it was proven these were ads for was in fact human trafficking, and they still run. In fact, the same language, barely legal, the petite, young, college girls, prettiest girls in Connecticut. It's pretty obviously what they're selling. But no one has stopped them. Now, you may remember the Craigslist controversy from about 2 years ago.
Right.
Yes.
Craigslist had a very similar section. In fact, it was called the escort section. And a lot of heat came out of Connecticut. A coalition of attorneys general from around the country were put together. And Craigslist, in a way, began to bow to that pressure in 2008. These were free ads that people could put up on Craigslist. Many of us use Craigslist to find a roommate or rent a home or find a job or sell our lawnmower.
Right.
But there's a section called under adult services called escort. And they were free to post. Anybody could get on there, post anything they wanted. Their rates, $100 an hour, $200 an hour for one or two girls at the same time. They could post photos. So the Coalition of Attorneys General got together with Craigslist and said, listen, if these are criminal, we need to be able to track who's ever doing this. So have them use a credit card, charge them a small fee, and have them use a phone number so that we can track them. And so they instituted this policy, and you know, and I tried to tell people at the time, you can go to Walmart and buy an anonymous cell phone with no tracking ability, and you can go to the end units at Walmart or CVS or Walgreens and buy a cash card with no way to trace it. And that's what they all used. Between November 2008 and September 2010, when Craigslist finally did pull these ads off their list, they made over $70 million just on those ads.
Wow.
In 2 years,
my
just
God.
on those ads. Well, there was so much heat coming out of Connecticut that another large media organization, Village Voice, who runs Backpage.com, never put their escort ads in Connecticut. However, many of the ads that were on Craigslist, the people using those, the pimps, the human traffickers, migrated to Backpage.com. But there was no way to do that in Connecticut until November 10th, 2011, just a few months ago. Suddenly, the escort section in Backpage in Connecticut appeared. And by November 13th, police had made, Simsbury police, had made their first prostitution arrest in the town's 300-year history.
Wow.
Because of Backpage.com had started these ads. So we've been monitoring these ads, and they mentioned the gaming facilities here in Connecticut, in or out call, which means the girl can either, you can go to her or she can come to you. But because of the internet, because of websites, not just like Backpage, but Facebook, and we'll go into that if you want to.
Yeah, I'd like to know about that on Facebook, yeah.
But hundreds of other escort paid-for sites, escorts.com, fling.com, the erotic review, where men can go on and review the girls they've been with the way we would a restaurant or a movie. You can now open a computer and have a girl or boy or young adult delivered to your home, your hotel room, within an hour, just like you would a pizza. You don't have to drive down the Berlin Turnpike anymore. You don't have to drive to a street corner and have someone look in your window anymore. You can sit with total anonymity in the privacy of your hotel room, your own home, and have these people delivered to you. Now, because of that anonymity, the customer, who's referred to as a John, the pimp, or the trafficker, same thing. Because now they're able to work with total, they think, anonymity on the internet, it's really exploding this thing. Through websites, first like Craigslist, then like Backpage.com. But with Backpage, or similar sites like it, a man has to go onto that website. If they're here in southern Connecticut, if they're along the shoreline, they'll go to Backpage or go to Connecticut, they'll click on New Haven, they'll go to escorts, and they see all the ads for that day. If we had an online computer, I could show you the hundreds of ads that are listed for this area right now, and the photos of the girls. They got tired of waiting for men to do that, because once they discovered how to use Facebook, and that most everyone, half of Americans now have a Facebook profile, they can troll, they can look through Facebook, they can see someone who has a profile up like Jim Driscoll, they can see a good-looking guy who's, you can see typically what town he lives in without even being friends with him on Facebook, and people know how this works. They can see maybe, a few of his photos. He has a nice car. He's a nice, normal, good-looking guy. So the girl has a profile that's a little bit sexualized. She looks a little bit fun and frisky, and she friends him. And so she does this to men all day long. Or somebody with a pimp running a fake profile will do this all day long. And most of us I've gotten friend requests from women I didn't know, whose profile photo looked a little bit more, maybe she's in a bikini or a little bit of negligee, or maybe it's just a bare shoulder up.
And is it really them, or is it someone just stole the photo and put them up, you think?
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both. Many times it's a fake profile, because what they're doing is they're trying to begin a conversation. What they're doing is they're knocking on your virtual door. Yeah. And so if the guy says, gee, I've got 200 friends, she looks kind of interesting, yeah, I'll friend her. Well, then she gets to see all of your information. She gets to see where you work. She gets to see what your relation status is, what town you live in, your wall. She gets to see your interests now with Facebook, with these timelines. The way Facebook works, going back to the day you joined Facebook, she can look at absolutely everything. Vacations you went on. So now she can pretend to be your friend and pretend to know a lot about you, because in fact she does. And then she might say, well, join my Twitter account, or hey, I'm going to be at this club tonight, or hey, let's get together. So they don't have to wait for the men to call in. They're actually reaching out and getting in. So what I wanted to say more about Facebook, and one of the issues that we're working on fiercely right now, is when I was doing research for the book and I saw this migration of this activity off of Craigslist and onto Backpage and then onto Facebook, I began to see thousands of profiles that were not only sexualized, but younger and younger and younger, until they were literally children, 6, 7 years old. And then I realized that child pedophiles were using Facebook to contact each other around the world without any border or language restrictions to trade and produce child pornography on Facebook. And there was just an enormous amount of it. So we reported it to the FBI, and from that point on began a campaign, really, to get Facebook to patrol itself so that these images and these videos don't get posted on their website in the first place. But we've hit a brick wall with Facebook. They are looking now at the largest initial public offering of common stock in history,
Right.
which would give them a market capitalization of $100 billion. And to address this issue would be to acknowledge this issue. So we've been to Washington, D.C. a couple of times. We're just trying to get this issue as well known to people as possible. Facebook is an extraordinary, unprecedented social tool. It's been used by people protesting in Egypt to take down governments, but like any technological tool, it can be used for very good, for liberty and freedom, or very bad for abuse and and the worst possible things that the human mind can come up with.
Unfortunately, that's the two sides of human nature.
It really is, and technology, technology itself, of course, is not bad or good, but it can magnify and does magnify the bad and the good and bad, the good and evil of mankind. You know, with the 20th century saw that. The millions that were killed in the wars in the 20th century. That would not have been possible without the technology, nor would it have been possible to stop it without the technology. So, you know, it's what we do.
Now,
with
pornography, I mean, that's against, not pornography,
Pornography.
child
pornography.
child pornography. That's against the law, right?
It's extremely.
So how do
it's
they-
interesting. It's had an interesting history, because in New York City, back in the Wild West days of the New York City in the 60s and the 70s along 8th Avenue, you could walk down in shops right out on the sidewalk and buy magazines with naked children in them. And
Really?
they then passed federal and state laws clamping down on that. And so it really didn't disappear completely, but it really got put out mostly from common. You really had to look for it, because the only way to trade it or have it was an actual print form. You had to take a picture, print it, and somehow get it to somebody. If you didn't have a printing press, if you didn't have the access to all of that, you couldn't do anything. Well, of course, then digital photography and the internet allowed it to explode again. All you need access to is a digital camera, an online computer, and a child. And a lot of people have access to those three things. So, child pornography is somewhat adult, what we call mainstream. The adult film industry is somewhat protected under First Amendment rights. Child pornography is not. There are strict laws defining child pornography in every state and federally, and it's quite severe, both the punishment and you can't even draw a sexualized picture of a child, or make one up that's a cartoon, or put one together on Photoshop.
Right.
It's all illegal, no matter what. If
Yeah.
it's a sexualized image of a child, it's illegal.
So how do they get away with this?
There's another law called the Internet Decency Act of 1996, which means if you have a website, you are not liable for what people post on that website. That's why Craigslist was never liable for the people posting escort ads. Neither is Backpage for the people posting escort or human trafficking ads on their website. So neither is Facebook or Google Plus or Microsoft Live or Twitter, which is also exploding with this kind of thing. Liable, really, for what people are using their website for. If Jimmy and I went up and built a poster board or a bulletin board in the town square in New Haven, we wouldn't be liable for what somebody posted on 2 years from now. It's sort of the same idea.
Yeah.
However, our argument is that if the child pornography is not protected by First Amendment rights, why should it be protected by this decency law of 1990s, this Internet Decency Law of 96? So we've written legislation to make these social networking websites much more responsible and much more accountable for what's on their website.
Right.
See, because the technology is there to keep this off their sites. It really is. That, you know, if they just put the resources at the time and quite frankly, acknowledge that it's there and address that it's there, they could get rid of it. Because there are other sites that do.
That's right. They should police those sites.
Yeah.
They really should. These children, do they, are they children that are kidnapped or children from all over? Or, I mean...
Well, there are many myths that we hear about in human trafficking that I address in the book. And I just got so frustrated with hearing these myths and these misconceptions constantly propagated by the media and by nonprofit organizations that they're kidnapped, they're smuggled in from other countries.
Right, yeah.
And, you know, that makes great headlines. And it makes great fundraising tools for nonprofit organizations. And it does happen to a degree. But the vast majority of how it happens is much more subtle and much more conniving. The vast majority of victims, as in this trial that took place in Hartford, are American. They're not from other countries, and they're not kidnapped. They're recruited, they're coerced, they're romanced into it by a man who comes along and can recognize the look in certain girls' eyes, certain boys' eyes, who have probably suffered abuse as a younger child. And now there's a vulnerability. An openness, a wanting. And they have been waiting all their life for someone to tell them they're special, they're worth something, and to treat them that way. And as soon as someone does in just that right way, they've got them. And what these traffickers, these pimps do is set up an intentional addiction to their personality. They actually get these girls in very short order to believe that they can't survive without them in their life. And there was an arrest in Rocky Hill, a very large apartment complex in Rocky Hill. Most people from that area know it. This guy had kept a girl who was in her 20s in his apartment for 3 months. She had a $2,000 a day quota. That's how much she was making for him every day. But they found stacks and stacks of books on hypnosis, sales techniques, neurolinguistic programming, everything to be able to control the mind of another person. So it's really like the Stockholm syndrome on steroids, and it's intentional. So they don't have to kidnap them. Think about it. If there's a silver alert or an amber alert for a girl in Oakland, California, or Orlando, we hear about it in Orange, Connecticut. You don't want the entire country looking for what is in its essence your product. So yes, it does. Kidnapping does happen, but the vast majority of it is simple recruitment. And you know, many times these pimps aren't what we think of in our head as a pimp. Many times it's a boyfriend, it's a parent, it's a husband that's working.
Their own.
Yeah, that's working.
And the little ones, because they do have that too. What about the little ones? Do the parents offer them up?
In many cases with the younger children, yeah, as we saw with in Waterbury, when the woman who was working as a prostitute herself sold her 2 children to the mayor of Waterbury, you know, for her own drug habit. So yeah, in many, especially when you bring drugs into the picture, and the motivation that the compulsion that really gives people, everything's on the table. To get that drug, everything's on the table, including their own children. Absolutely, yeah. Wow. Many times. See, we hear about stranger danger. You know, that phrase that the kids are being taught and have been taught for a long time now, and they should be, that, you know, a stranger approaches you. But many times when the abuse happens, when the kidnapping happens, it's not a stranger. The majority of time, it's someone they know. Because how do you explain to a child that they have to be cautious of the uncle, the neighbor, the brother, the priest? Or the teacher, as we're finding out now in some towns here in Connecticut or in New York. It's much more devious than and hard to explain and complicated. Go ahead.
You know, when you have, I've had in conversation with people when we start talking about, you know, prostitution. It is such a gray area with people. You know, they figure, you know, there's not much information on that. They think of someone who's poverty, on the street corner, just a drug addict, getting that, you know, don't realize that really there's more, that's much more involved, and that person isn't on welfare, who is a pimp, he or she. I mean, sorry, he's not a prostitute, he or she. It could be, from what I've heard in stories, they could be college students, or kids that, just like you said, vulnerable out of high school, at the wrong place at the wrong time, and that person gets a hold of them and bang, it's that fast.
What I say is to people when I do lectures and tell people about this issue, human nature does not pay attention to skin color, geography, ethnicity, any type of demographics. It just doesn't care. So from the pimp side and those being abused side, they come from all walks of life. And it's another myth I try to dispel in the book. People think that the people in this come from either a certain ethnicity or a certain type of economic background or a certain part of a certain city. It's not true at all. One of the victims we've worked closely with for a number of years is from a small suburb outside of Hartford, had a very normal childhood growing up, went to, was on the cheerleading squad, worked in a local restaurant, but because there was that compulsion towards drugs, somebody came along, like you said, at the right time and got her into this. Now, from the time, in this particular case, from the time she met the man who would become her pimp to her first date with a client, paid date with a client, was 4 hours.
Oh,
she met the pimp, he put her on Craigslist, calls started coming in, and he delivered to her first date, all within 4 hours. That's how desperate she was and how ripe she was and how good he was at finding girls like this. And you're right, Jimmy, when they talk about prostitution, it's a gray area. You get people all over the map. Well, if it's two consenting adults and money's exchanged, so what? Who knows about that? You could argue that all day long. The thing is, when you have prostitution, let me explain what human trafficking is, can hide within that. And first let me explain how the federal government looks at human trafficking. And it's a pretty simple definition. A commercial sex act or any forced labor or any labor where there is force, fraud, or coercion involved. Those are the three legal tests under federal law, under this law I mentioned earlier, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Now, when you have a pimp, there's going to be force or fraud or coercion. It doesn't take all three, you just have to prove one of the three. If the victim is under 18 years of age, that legal test is irrelevant. If it's a boy, girl, 17 or younger, and it's a commercial sex act or any sexual act, including dancing, that is human trafficking under federal law. So when we take that definition, we see that it really opens it up to a much wider scope of activity and things going on, especially when we look at some of the descriptions of things going on the internet. Now, when people say, well, if we legalized it or deregulated it or decriminalized it, then it wouldn't be a crime anymore, and it would be open, and this abuse wouldn't happen anymore. Well, let's look at that.
Yes.
In Rhode Island, until a little over a year ago, many people don't realize this, indoor prostitution was not illegal. It wasn't legal, but there was no law against indoor prostitution.
What do you mean to our viewers? Yeah.
You couldn't walk the streets, but you could be in a strip joint, you could be in a house, you could be in a massage spa, and do anything you wanted for money, and they couldn't arrest you. So every strip joint in Rhode Island, till about 1.5 years ago, was a virtual brothel. You would walk in, and girls would immediately approach you and ask you to go upstairs or go to a booth. What would happen, and we would observe this, is that after they serviced a few customers, they would take the cash and go out to the parking lot and give it to the pimp in his car. So, is that prostitution or is that human trafficking? If they're giving all the money to the pimp and he's coercing her into this or defrauding her, not giving her any of the money or forcing her in some way, that's human trafficking disguising as prostitution that at the time wasn't illegal. Rhode Island finally came to terms with themselves and they passed a law saying, okay, you can't do this anymore. I don't know where the enforcement is with that. because we've seen a huge disparity between the laws that exist. Even here in Connecticut, we have a human trafficking law, and most every state does now as well. However, there's not much enforcement of those laws taking place in the states around the country.
So that was my point. Like, is basically what is the state of Connecticut kind of doing? What is Rhode Island doing? I mean, are they cracking down on prostitution? Is it, it's not high on the priority list? What do you know about it?
And injecting one more question
Sure.
into that. Isn't the only way they could get them is tax evasion? Isn't that the thing that they worry about most? They're not getting their cut, the government?
In this case, they did bring in the IRS to look at taxes, but they really threw a bunch of laws at them because it's a really hard and unknown law for law enforcement right now. Think about I compared to the war on drugs. Every local, state, and federal law enforcement officer, or agency, and judge and prosecuting attorney knows how to investigate and prosecute drug crimes. You give them a human trafficking law or crime, and they have to go study. There are a few federal prosecutors and investigators who know a lot about it. There's a very few state and almost no local. When I'm talking about human trafficking laws, not prostitution laws. Prostitution laws in Connecticut are pretty clear. For promoting prostitution, which is what a pimp would get, it's a Class B misdemeanor. You'd get about 30 days probably.
Give the audience one more explanation about human trafficking compared to prostitution, so they'll know exactly the difference.
And it's an extraordinary question, and that's really, if you ask the most local law enforcement officers, they wouldn't know the difference. And prostitution laws really vary state by state, and sometimes town by town and state by state. But typically, it's any money that's exchanged for a sexual act.
That is
prostitution. Yeah. Human trafficking is where someone is forced or defrauded or coerced into that act.
Okay.
Or if the person carrying out that act is under 18 years of age, then it's human trafficking. Okay. So it's a good question because of this. When you hear the word child prostitute or teenage prostitute, under that law, there's really no such thing. That's a victim. You really don't have a prostitute. Sort of says, okay, that's we're thinking.
Yeah, prostitute says okay. It's her choice. She wants to.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But how do you do that with someone who's 14 or 15 years old?
Right.
So that's the difference right there, and very few, and that's hard to see. It's hard for law enforcement to see, both on a local and state level. So typically, they'll try to get them on some other charge if it's a large ring they're busting up.
Did they ever come into question, like maybe even use the term of kidnapping? Because it's almost, I mean, I don't know the legal term of kidnapping, but the three, I mean, even the coercion, I mean, holding someone against their will, because basically that's a fine line in law.
It's a lot. Here's a tough part. Here's why they don't use kidnapping, and they couldn't in this case. Holding someone against the will is having them locked in a room, or chained, or in other words, jailed, bound in some way. And in many of these instances, they're just not. The girls in this case were allowed to go home to Vermont at Christmas time. The pimp, when she called and wanted to go back home, and some friends of hers came to pick her up, the pimp took them out to dinner to Red Lobster in Wethersfield, and then they were on their way, and they came back. So so that's what's difficult to prosecute in this.
It's psychologically bound. Basically,
and that's where the coercion comes in.
Yeah.
And that's what's so difficult to prove. How do you? And the defense in this case was, these girls went home for Christmas and then came back and said, "Yeah, put me, start me working again." How is that being forced into it or coerced into it if they voluntarily came back?
Ray,
that's when it gets confusing.
It's not funny, but the two different moods. If you bring up in conversation, you say kidnapped, red flag. Oh my God, really?
Yeah.
And then now you say human trafficking. It's just it throws people out of balance. You automatically think. I'm not saying you in general, but I'm going to going to make this statement out here. When you say human trafficking, people think, oh my God, the people in the poor countries, they're trafficking young people, this, that, the other thing. They don't realize, like we've just been talking about, human trafficking goes right here in the United States.
And that's really the reason I wrote the book, was to give a voice to the victims to whom it happens here in the United States. And it happens in every community all over America. And it happens in every community because of the internet and because of human nature. But you're absolutely right. When people hear human trafficking, they think Thailand, they think Eastern Europe, they think Africa. And absolutely, it's horrible. Especially my first book was on child trafficking in all of its forms around the world.
You went to Iran too, didn't you?
Iraq in 2008, yeah, to look at this. And at the time, people were saying, oh, it's not there, it's not there, it's not there. Well, especially with child trafficking, whenever you've got a severe poverty, when you've got severe political strife or warfare conflict, you're going to have trafficking, human trafficking, because there's just too much money to be made when the law breaks down like that.
Correct.
So, there it was. I mean, it was just, I do stories from soldiers, stories from contractors, like, oh my gosh, yeah, we're seeing the young girls, Iraqi families are selling their daughters and going to Syria to work as prostitutes, so it was everywhere. So, it's not difficult to find, you just need to know where to look and how to look for it and the signs of it. So when we think of human trafficking, yes, we think of forced labor, which is its largest form around the world,
right,
in the chocolate industry, the diamond industry, coffee industry, and even the fishing industry in the Pacific Rim, and some manufacturing here in the United States, but a lot of manufacturing around the world. And there's that fine line between what is exploitive labor and what is slave labor. Apple's catching a lot of heat now for the people that are building its components in China. They have 1 million people building components for our iPhones and our iPads in China. And some horror stories are coming out of those factories. But we also have child soldiers in Africa. Yeah. We have forced marriage. We have organ harvesting. All of these are human trafficking, but the one myth that people really think of trafficking, and I can understand, it doesn't necessarily mean movement. They think trafficking, they think smuggling across borders,
yes,
they think smuggling across state lines,
yes,
and that's where the Mann Act comes in, that 100-year-old law that if you brought anybody across a state line for an immoral purpose, you were breaking the law. Well, they started arresting everybody they wanted to for men who were cheating on their wives. It got crazy. But human trafficking, doesn't necessarily involve movement. Again, we go back to the drug trafficking scenario. If I had a meth lab in my house and I was selling meth or out of my own home, that would be drug trafficking.
That's drug trafficking, yeah.
But I'm not taking it anywhere. I'm not
right,
moving it anywhere. It's really marketing. It's another word for marketing. So, again, one of those myths. It happens somewhere else, and it's people just being smuggled all around. Yes, that does happen, but in the form it takes here in the United States, it's a different animal of the same species, and we have to recognize how it works here. And because we have this much more technology, much more access to technology, of course, that's where it's landing, that's where it's going, and that's what's being used to sell it.
What's Connecticut doing now? Do you know?
When you mean?
What are they doing? What are they doing?
Yeah.
Just I'm going to throw out that vague question. Are they on? I think we know the Speaker of the House just is trying to pass a bill now.
Well, yeah, there is a human trafficking law in Connecticut that is built on that coercion legal test. Mm-hmm. There's so much more that could be done. The Federal Department of Justice wrote a model state law for all the states to use just a year ago.
A year ago?
Yeah, just a year ago, so that the states could say, okay, here's a law we could institute. So what we've done is taken that and some other very good laws that other states have passed, and put it in one comprehensive bill, piece of legislation for the current legislative session here in Connecticut, including California recently passed a law that any business doing over $100 million worth of business has to report to the Attorney General's Office of California what they're doing to make sure there's no human trafficking or exploitive labor in their supply chain. That's just California. New York passed a law called the Second Chance Law that anyone who has been arrested for prostitution but then is found later that it's actually a victim of human trafficking gets their criminal record expunged. Great law so people can get a fresh start. It's one of the huge stumbling blocks of somebody trying to get their life back who's been victimized by this is that they have this criminal record that follows them, whether they're trying to get a job or get into the military service. So we put this together in one comprehensive package. Connecticut has an opportunity right now in 2012 to be an absolute leader in the nation in human trafficking laws. We could really become a model for what states can do, because a lot of this isn't going to be up to the federal government. They, it's just not their place to be doing some of the things that should be done on a state level. So we really have an opportunity right now to address this issue with this legislation that's being introduced.
Amazing.
What took them so long?
That's a very good question. I think it exposed
You might go
itself.
out on the limb a little bit here, with your answer, but what?
I think when I mentioned earlier that the internet allowed this anonymity for the buyer and the seller on the commercial sexual aspect issue and for everything related to that, it also exposed it. Anybody could see it. You didn't have to drive around on the streets anymore to see it. All of a sudden you were able to go online and just see it everywhere and on different websites. And it's like when you added it all together, there it all was. And then you started to get prostitution arrests in Clinton, in Simsbury, in local towns that had never had them before because of this. And you had advocacy groups saying, listen, this is how this problem exists and this is why it's exploding. Yes, the street corner prostitution, human trafficking still exists. The way we see the hidden footage on TV sometimes of the girl,
Right.
crouching into the car to make a deal. But the vast majority is online. It did two things. It took it off the street so people weren't complaining about it anymore, but it also put it on a place where everybody could see it. And where you didn't have local people calling up complaining, well, I think there's someone working the streets or there's somebody walking through my motel lobby that it looks a little fishy. Now you had advocacy groups that knew the victims, knew what the problem looked like, knew what to look for online, and started to get smart and work with local law enforcement and legislators to say, listen, the laws we have now just aren't protecting these victims. They don't have a voice. And then we get into the entire area of what happens to these victims after they come off the streets, when they are rescued. And there are so few services that are effective because the restoration process for these victims is really lifelong. It takes when we look at someone who's gone through child sexual abuse, who had an abuser, that's a lifelong restoration.
Right.
We know that, and we're becoming more sensitive to that. And we know as far as the female population, that's a third or maybe a quarter of the population. Huge amount of victims. But these are victims that have had multiple abusers for money. That's an entirely different level of abuse and an entirely different kind of restoration. They have been convinced intentionally that rape is normal, that's all they're good for, that's all they're made for, that's their purpose in life. So how do you take a person who is convinced that's what they're for, that's their best way to make money even when they get released or get out of a program? That's always the way they can make some money. How do you convince them that what a healthy relationship is like with men, with women, with God? That takes a lifetime of one-to-one effort. That's not going to be a government agency. It's not going to be a nonprofit organization. It's going to be some people coming along the side saying, we've got your back, and for the rest of your life will be here with you. And nobody wants to do that. I mean, that's just too hard for people to do. So they're out there on their own right now, you know, and they fall back into it. The recidivism in this is huge.
They're dehumanized.
Completely dehumanized. They're commodified.
Yep.
They're not just an object, but they're a commodity to be sold. Remember, if you're a drug dealer, you got to sell your drugs, and then you got to take some of that money and go buy a new stash of drugs to resell. So, okay, your profit margin might be 50%. With this, your profit margin's 100%. You get your product back every time you sell it. So and there's far less suspicion with the police. If you've got a if you got a car full of drugs, you're going to jail.
You're going to jail.
You got a few girls in your car, so what? So, and they don't even know how to really prosecute or investigate. So it's a much less risky crime. You know, we hear from cops all over the country, the girl is becoming the new drug.
Now, have you ever run into any instances where I've heard is that the I'm going to say the prostitute has been arrested, and they go to court. They do their trial. Whether they go to court, whether it be probably a misdemeanor now is basically is it a misdemeanor or?
It depends on the actual circumstances under which they get arrested. But go ahead.
And they get out of court, and they go right back to the pimp.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's their safe haven.
Yeah, he'll bail them out.
Yeah.
In fact, in this case as well, the bond bailsmen they go in, they bail the girls out, and they say, well, here's how you're going to pay back your bond. And they start working for the bond bailsman.
Unbelievable.
Who's also tied together with the pimp. So they're all working in cahoots with each other.
My God.
And if she tries to get away from the pimp, well, the bond bailsman can actually make the arrest and go find her and get her back, get her out, put her in jail.
That's slavery. That's slavery.
It sure is, and that's it's why we call it modern day slavery. You know, but it's a very disguised form of it.
So many people don't know about this. So many people
think that slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah.
There are more slaves in the world today than ever before in human history.
I agree. I so agree with that. Yeah, amazing.
Well, what can our viewers do if they're interested? How can they get involved? I mean, it seems to me that it's people like yourself that are getting this job done more than law enforcement and government and everything else.
Well, it's all of us together.
Okay.
You know,
I mean, you're bringing it to their attention, though.
Trying to.
Right.
You know, and it's really multidisciplinary. It's people from law enforcement, legislative people from nonprofits, people from religious institutions, educational institutions, and there is a growing movement of people from all walks of life banding together and saying, okay, what do we really need to do? And what I don't want to do is have the voice of the victims get lost in all this, because you know, there's all sorts of people calling themselves experts on this, or saying we should do this, or this is the answer, that's the answer, and once again, the victims get lost in this. The people who need help get lost in this. So what people can do is, yes, they can call their legislators and urge them to look at this legislation we've got in front of the Connecticut legislator session now. They can go to the Facebook cause. We've started a Facebook cause to get child pornography off of Facebook. It's got 55,000 members right now. They can go to stopchildpornonfacebook.com and send a message to Mark Zuckerberg directly from that website. It's a number of things they can do. It all depends on how much they want to give of themselves, and that's you really don't get anything done in the world that's hard to get done, really affect change, to help people's lives, if you're not willing to sacrifice. And if you're not willing to sacrifice yourself in this issue,
when you say sacrifice,
your time, in many ways, your innocence. You're going to see things, hear things, and be exposed to things that you don't know exist right now, and you really don't. You would rather not know.
Yeah,
exist.
I know. It's true.
I mean, I've seen images. I've talked to people. I've seen things happen that I would really rather not have ever been exposed to. And it changes you. It changes you to your very core, and put it right out there, it can ruin your life, and in many ways it did mine. I'll just say that. It just, but because but you don't do it for a payback. People say, well, this work must be so rewarding. It's not.
When you say ruin your life, I don't want to scare the viewers away. What do you mean by ruin your life?
Well, you know, if that's going to scare people away, okay, then this is not a fight for them.
Okay.
So, but it can ruin you just financially. It can ruin your sleep. It can ruin your emotional well-being.
Okay.
It can ruin relationships in your life because, as Jimmy said, nobody understands this or gets it. And when you throw your life into it, the people around you are like, "What are you doing this for?" You know, but that's true with any human rights or human advocacy
Well, you know
program,
what?
you know?
My pet thing that, is animal rights.
I was just going to say.
And yes, it has made me very sad, and
Yeah.
I walk around sad a lot. But I figure, my thought is, if I don't do it,
Yeah.
who else is going to do
Yeah.
it? Okay, a lot of people are going to do it, but if each one thought like that, nothing would ever get done.
I know, exactly.
There are
So-
times I don't want to
exactly.
put anything more on Facebook. I don't want to see any more abuse.
I know.
But you got to do it.
There,
And so I can understand it from that level,
I was at the Potters League, the animal shelter in Newport today, just looking at the kitty cats, and I wanted to take them all home. I mean,
know.
how do you walk out of that door? And
Right.
it's just I want to go and I want to see because I want to help, but to walk away from them. Now, how come we can do that to cats? But if a girl has got a criminal record, if she's been on drugs, if she's been in and out of the foster care system, if she's not doing great in school, or she's dropped out, we can't do it with her.
And how do you help those victims? How do you help them? Where do they go? Once they try to get out, okay, you get them away from a pimp.
There is nowhere.
There's nowhere for them to go. They got to try to fit back into society. They're going to go back home. How are they going to go back home? Where's home? Does home exist anymore?
Yeah.
We have a minute left. Okay, I wanted to ask, is there a name for that legislation? So if people want to go on and
The
tell...
legislative session just started yesterday in
Okay.
Connecticut, and I know this will air. And the bill does not have a number yet.
Okay.
But it's going to have trafficking in the name, and so it'll be very easy to find on the Connecticut State Legislature website. Just to look for trafficking.
All right, if they go on your website or your Facebook page or anything like that, will they
My
be able
Facebook
to?
page, you can go to the Berlin Turnpike Facebook page.
That page, okay.
The Berlin Turnpike on Facebook.
We're going to bring that up, I think,
Yeah,
right?
or you can go to the berlinturnpike.com, and we'll put all the information there as it progresses.
Okay.
We're certainly gonna have this in the public. You won't be able to ignore it. It'll be out there. We're gonna
Great.
try to
Super.
publicize as much
Good.
as possible.
So glad to have you on
Thank
the
you
show.
both for having
oh
me. This
man,
has been
thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
I know I
so
did a lot of
much.
the talking.
You're supposed to do the talking.
That's right. That's the idea.
So interesting. Okay, we're going to put your contact information up now.
Terrific.
Contact information for Raymond Bechard, author of A Berlin Turnpike, A True Story of Human Trafficking in America. The email is raymond@raymondbechard.com. The phone is 910-722-9729. The website is www.theberlinturnpike.com. And the address is P.O. Box 498, Old Saybrook, Connecticut, 06475.
To learn more information about the show or any of the past shows, please contact us at healingoutsidethebox@yahoo.com or to reach Rosemary Lachance at phone number 203-627-7966 at www.rosemarylachance.com, or you could reach me, Jimmy Driscoll, phone number 860-334-9968, or email me at jimmydriscoll@msn.com. We are also on Facebook under Healing Outside the Box.
All right, and tonight's quote is this: foolish, selfish people are always thinking of themselves, and the result is always negative. Wise people think of others, helping them as much as they can, and the result is happiness. Love and compassion are beneficial both for you and others. Through your kindness to others, your mind and your heart will open to peace. And that's from the Dalai Lama.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time. Good night.
Okay.
As you look out through the window to the world you have made, always know you are the vision. See the truth, darkness fades.